And the whole picture is of someone who has been through an incredible historical event and wants to communicate to a later generation some of the lessons of that event. And one of those lessons is that you can't moralise your way out of an epidemic.
Welcome to HIV The Morning After. I'm Dan Hall. I'm a documentary producer and director. I've spent my entire adult life watching ignorance and prejudice play out around HIV. And frankly, I'm tired of it. And I'm sure many of you are too. This podcast is an attempt to do something about that, not through lectures or statistics, but by doing what I do best, interviewing people and letting them tell their own stories. Real voices, lived experiences, no bullshit. These conversations matter, and if you think so too, please rate, review, and share HIV The Morning After. I can make these episodes, but I can't make people listen to them or find them on their algorithms. That bit's down to you. You can reach me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. Right then, let's get started. Today, I'm speaking with Gus Cairns, a man whose life story reads like a testament to the power of accidental purpose. Now 69, Gus was diagnosed with HIV in 1985 when he was just 29, a bright but aimless Oxford graduate drifting through London's expanding gay scene. What followed was a journey through devastating loss, near-death experiences, and an extraordinary medical resurrection that would transform him into one of the UK's most respected HIV educators and activists. But perhaps, most remarkably, Gus tells his story with the insights of someone who spent decades not just surviving trauma, but making sense of it, and using that understanding to help others navigate their own paths through crisis. Gus, welcome to HIV The Morning After.
Thanks, Dan.
Can you take us back to July 1985? And you've mentioned in your research notes that this was the first and only time you fell in love at first sight.
I met an amazing, extraordinary person called Paul. Paul Lever, his name was. The reaction to Paul was summed up by one of my housemates at the time who said, why are you going out with that maniac? Paul was from a very different walk of life from me. He was the son of a pub landlady and an electrician. He was sort of looked like a very rough and ready sort of skinhead guy. I met him on the dance floor at Heaven. What a cliche is that? And I was just knocked sideways by him, as much by the power of his personality. He was an extraordinary combination of being confrontative and being warm as a person. He was very difficult. Frankly, he was an alcoholic, as his dad had been. And if AIDS had not caught him, I wonder if we would have stayed together. But he was also, like a lot of alcoholics, sensitive, underneath vulnerable, warm and lovable. And we were together for 4.5 years.
Can you tell me what the London of 1985 was like? What was the gay scene like then?
I think that the commercial gay scene in London was kind of born, or the present-day commercial gay scene in London was born the night that Heaven Disco opened, because that was 10 times bigger than any previous gay club. And I'd been hanging around the London gay scene for a bit previous to that. And it was split roughly into the old-fashioned Soho drinking scene in pubs and gentlemen's clubs, and a few sort of fancy-ish small private clubs in Piccadilly, and then a kind of newborn sort of lefty, punky, anarcho, anti-Thatcher sort of scene that was sort of happening in kind of pubs in Islington. But really, it was small. You had to know people who were in on it. A lot of gay men, particularly outside London, still met each other cruising. and then public toilets, things like that. That's how I got to meet other gay men while I was growing up as a teen. So I think heaven transformed it. There was a lot going on. The night I met Paul, I was cycling back from a pub production of a gay play in which I was playing identical twin brothers, one of whom was gay. This is good. There we are. That kind of shows you pretty much exactly what my life was like at that point.
Well, I'd say, weren't you knackered? Like, if I'd have just done a play, the last thing I think I'd want to go to is Heaven nightclub. I'd just be exhausted.
Funny thing is, I've never particularly been in gym culture, but in those days, I think I was very fit. I cycled everywhere. I had cycled from Wimbledon. I think I said in my questionnaire that in the beginning, during the first half of the 80s, which was really my sort of glory days before AIDS, one of my slacker jobs was I got a job as a bus conductor for 3 years on the 8s and the 25s from Bow Bus Garage. Now, bus conducting on double-decker buses is a job that keeps you extraordinarily fit. Of course, they don't have them these days, but you're running up and down stairs all day. And so I think at that point in my life, I was actually extremely fit.
Taking you back to that summer before you met Paul, so it's 1984.
Initially, the HIV test was a surprise. The other part of my reaction to being told I had HIV, I think, as well as denial, was shock. I literally do not remember. This feels slightly embarrassing to talk about because I'm not normally embarrassed, but leave it in. If you're shagging around on the gay scene in the early 80s when nobody's using condoms, and I was shagging around because I was quite good looking and I was horny, and I caught every STI you can get, basically. I will tell you, for the amusement of your listeners, my syphilis diagnosis story. I went to the Colhern, which was the notorious old leather bar in Earl's Court, mentioned in a Strangler song. And it was all very much the old-fashioned sort of clone look, all these guys with moustaches looking like older versions of Freddie Mercury, And I was standing at the bar, literally, and the guy next door to me looked me up and down and said, I don't like the look of that rash. I'm a doctor. I think it might be syphilis. I recommend you go to the clinic and have a test. It was syphilis. That was in 1970. Oh, geez. No, 1979, when I was 23. So they were the forewarners. If somebody with my history presented at a clinic these days, I would expect them to say, here's PrEP. You need to start taking PrEP, and probably doxy-PEP too. And we have these answers these days, and then we didn't. So I got my syphilis sorted out with 2 big injections of penicillin and all that sort of thing. I was starting to work at Centrepoint Soho, the night shelter for young people. That was very stressful. I came down with what I myself diagnosed as hepatitis B, because I kind of knew I got the symptoms. But I also got a clutch of very severe mouth ulcers. And I remember the doctor at the clinic, this was when I was still attending Royal London, being so interested in these that he asked my permission to take a photo of them. And that is a classic clear seroconversion symptom of HIV.
Now then, when you met Paul, I understand that he'd already tested positive. Now that was quite unusual, wasn't it, for 85?
It was extremely, especially for a sort of publican son from Putney. I don't actually know why he tested. I think he was just the kind of person that had to know. I think it was an extraordinarily bold plan at the time, and let me be clear, I tested positive, and this is a radical thing to say, because I was so besotted by him that I actually wanted to be positive too. Now, you hear about people saying things like that later. I wasn't in any kind of denial about AIDS. It was just that at that time, we were on the cusp of realising the harm that it was about to do. So at the time I was thinking, well, it's perhaps another STD, something like that. It means we can carry on bonking, basically, without condoms. But the clinic I used to go to, which was at the Royal London, to have, if you're on the gay scene and you're in your early 20s and you're quite good looking, you tend to catch STIs. And so that was my clinic. But they wouldn't give me an HIV test because their ethics committee had decided that it was essentially a death sentence and that people would go and, throw themselves onto the district line.
Okay, so that's fascinating, though. So the idea of that initial place was that they would not take responsibility for giving you information that they thought you would then take to kill yourself with.
You've got to remember that with AIDS at that time, they saw no reason, and we still see no reason why, if you catch it and there's no treatment for it, it isn't going to kill you. It is going to kill you. So they had to react to it in an unusual way, I think.
Now, I grew up becoming sexually active for the first years of my life, having sex with condoms. And then later in my life, because of PrEP, having sex without condoms. Sex is better without condoms. It's better, it's more intimate, it's more connected. It is so much better. And I remember all those ghastly ads in the 90s trying to tell us that condoms were sexy, that they were fun. I know the ads were well-meaning, but it was just bollocks, and we knew it was bollocks.
I think it's particularly strong if you're gay or lesbian, because if you spent your teen years, maybe it doesn't happen quite so much these days, but it still does. If you spent your teen years fancying your straight schoolmates and longing for them, and then someone comes along who looks like one of them, but fancies you just as much, then it's an absolutely intoxicating experience. For the first time round, you feel physically connected to someone in a completely consensual and what's the word, celebratory kind of way. And that's love. So that was Paul. And he fascinated me in all sorts of other ways. He was from sort of different, my parents weren't upper class, but they were sort of solid middle class teachers. My mum was arty, he fascinated me because he was at the sort of other end of the class spectrum, because he was I was fundamentally introvert and bookish. He was fundamentally extrovert. He also had all sorts of fascinating connections, some of them dubious, with the commercial gay scene. So he was just wild. And he was wild. I've always loved wild boys. I have a video of him still when Princess Di came to open the AIDS ward and St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, where he was staying, and he's on it talking to her. This is when I learnt about AIDS and what it does to people.
What year are we now?
He died on the 5th of January 1990. I met him in July 1985.
Okay, then.
And this is when I'm going to get emotional. Oh, God. First couple of years, he was himself. We had a pretty wild time. We went on a few holidays. He met my family. They were charmed by him because he was on his best behaviour. And then he started getting dark marks on his limbs, chaos lesions. This would be 87. I remember he went on holiday with me to see a friend of ours who'd moved to Spain. And I could see these coming up. And he was getting thinner. Flash forward a year, 1989, the lesions are all over his body. He's very thin. He still battles through it with a great deal of spirit. He's still trying to, he went through a bad patch where he drank even more, but now he's sobered up, mainly because his body won't tolerate alcohol anymore. He's enrolled in North London Uni studying maths. He's kind of trying to sort himself out a bit, but he's very, very ill, okay? December 1985, he's more or less permanently in the HIV ward at St Mary's. He's very sick. He's got all kinds of HIV-related symptoms. He can't hold food down. He can't do this. He can't do that. He's still very much got his marbles together. He never lost his mind, but he is frightened a lot. And, you know, he's a sort of never say die person, but he was realizing that he was going to die. And apparently my mother told me some years afterwards that he had told her that how afraid he was of dying. Which he didn't tell me about. He was charmed all the nurses. We had a small, very lively Jack Russell dog called Peanuts, who we were both devoted to. They allowed me to smuggle the dog into the ward through the cargo lift, very, very naughtily. And also then Princess Di came, and Paul was one of the people who was chosen to talk to her. And the video, you'll see this very skinny guy, very chatty, sort of camp cockney, wearing shorts that showed the KS lesions on his legs. And when I asked him why he did that, he said, I want them to see what it was like.
And I think, rather beautifully, while we've been talking, I've found the video of him with Diana. He's in a fantastic pair of L'Oreal type shorts, isn't he?
Yes, exactly. It's on Getty Images. If you got the right one.
and a rather lovely. In fact, he's in the same colour top as Diana.
Yes, he is. I remember they were coordinated. And you can hear him. Because I found that video only about 10 years ago, and I thought, oh God, yeah. I remember he was very East End, but I've forgotten how camp he was, which he is. Never Say Die. He insisted on being taken to Paris for New Year. While he was in Paris, he caught his final, as it turned out, dose of pneumonia. I had to arrange an emergency flight back. It was freezing cold January. The ambulance men came off duty to take him back to my place because he said he wanted to die at home. A nurse from St Mary's came to look after him. He stayed at my place for 3 days. On the one hand, it's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. To simply be there while someone you love is just slipping slowly out of consciousness and dying. At one point, I said to my friends, listen, I can't stand this anymore. I'm going to have to go to the pub and have a drink. It's the one time in my life I've poured beer down my throat and stayed completely sober. I remember that. Came back. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, and he said to me, I thought you'd disappeared. I thought I'd given you up. No, I said, I'm still here. Goes to bed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he wakes me up. I was trying to struggle out of bed. I said, what are you doing? He said, I want to go to the loo. His mum tried to help him go to the loo, and he couldn't do it. And then he tried again. And I said, look, Brenda, that was her name. Don't help him. He needs to do this by himself. So he struggled at the loo, barely able to walk, had a pee. I said, did you manage to have a pee? He said, yes, fell back on the bed. That was his last moment of consciousness. About 5 o'clock in the morning, he wakes me up again, making some awful, terrible noise, animal-like kind of noise, like terror and screeching. And I asked the nurse who was there, is this it? Is he dying? She said, no, he's not. He's having a dream. And I remember thinking, he's never going to wake up and be able to tell me what that dream was like. And about midday on January the 5th, I suddenly noticed he wasn't breathing anymore, and that was Paul's death. As soon as the doctor came along and certified him, I remember insisting on going down to Hackney Town Hall and having his death registered, and absolutely insisting that AIDS was recorded on his death certificate, because I know he would want it to be.
And why was that a big statement from Paul?
He taught me defiance. You know, I was a bit, I kind of had my beliefs, but I was a little bit sort of peely-wally, as my Scots granny would say, before then.
Because people were not putting AIDS down, were they, as the cause
No,
of
exactly.
death?
So, but Paul's attitude would always be to do exactly the opposite and say, no, I've got AIDS, fuck you.
So then Paul has died, and how are you?
First year I was out of it. I didn't really want to do anything. I grew my hair long for the first time since I left uni. And there, a few friends were very kind to me. I remember the first time I went to a gay club, but that wasn't for I think I managed about 9 months later, and I went off to, it wasn't Trade, it was the predecessor of Trade at Turnmills. It was called FF, and I remember going there, but I was still feeling a bit alienated and disconnected. But I was involved in some of the very early trials of HIV drugs. I was on the Concord trial for AZT.
And how was that for you? Because in my other interviews
Bloody
for this
awful.
podcast, it's people have just said it was ghastly.
Yes, I got my anemia. Basically, I was I lasted 6 weeks, and then I said I'm not taking this anymore. At that point, I was already developing an interest in sort of counselling, psychotherapy, mental health because of my work with homeless youth. I wanted to know what kind of made them tick and how to help them. So I started a counselling course. And I met people who'd done various sorts of like empowerment workshops and all that sort of thing. There was a thing called the AIDS Mastery, where you spent all weekend in a room kind of emoting about having HIV. I'm sounding a little cynical. It wasn't. It was very powerful. Through that, I met this extraordinary and notorious character called Cass Mann, who was a kind of HIV wellness guru. Now, Cass was in some ways extremely dodgy. These days he would be a sort of anti-vaxxer or something. He himself was an extraordinary character, having been a kind of, a kind of club runner in his youth. But he ran these empowerment workshops, and at that time they were what I needed to hear. I never became an AIDS denialist or anything like that, but I did need something that was different from taking drugs that didn't work to give me a sense of hope and possibility. And so I joined Cass's outfit, who were called Positively Healthy. Entered this extraordinary period where I started getting sick. But I think I can honestly say that my mental health started getting better.
Why do you think that is? There's a bit of a dichotomy there.
Because I think I'd caught some of Paul's defiance. There was something of him inside me. I was looking for a kind of survivor's mentality. And what I found was a kind of an ability. Now, what do they call it? It's not exactly dissociation, but ability to kind of split myself into two systems of belief. One was still realistic about the fact that I might well die of HIV. And yet at the same time, one part of me didn't seriously think I was ever going to die. And I remember sitting in the clinic at because I went through numerous clinics at this point. They always wanted me to take AZT and all that, and I wouldn't. I remember one of my doctors begging me. And I was just giving some blood, and I had this terrible TB-like opportunistic infection, and I was getting fevers, and I was just sitting there, and I was on morphine, by the way, and sitting there in the clinic waiting room, and thinking, oh, well, maybe this is all right. Maybe it's okay to die. Maybe I could just sort of waste away slowly in a sort of vague kind of comfort. And then immediately catching myself thinking that and being horrified at my own train of thought.
So it's 1995 and you're in your car with a copy of Nature.
I'm reading the report of the Dr. David Howe's trials of combination therapy and seeing the virus load disappear in his subjects.
And what does that mean in layman's terms?
Well, I'd been a bit of a sort of, not exactly an HIV denialist, as I said, but an HIV dissident in the sense of not doing everything the doctors wanted me to do. I did absolutely everything else. I did the whole gamut of alternative therapies. everything from shiatsu to Chinese herbs to sort of, wild men drumming in the woods weekends. I did a so-called vision quest, which involved sitting on a Welsh hillside fasting for 3 nights while I nearly froze to death. But I did know science. I did know a bit of science, and that enabled me to turn on a sixpence and go, right, I want these drugs. And I knew too many people at that point who were sucked into the AIDS denialism rabbit hole and were taught that the drugs were poison and the only positive thinking would keep them alive. Of course, they're all dead now.
And that's always a difficult narrative, isn't it? Because there's the sense of blaming the people for what has happened. You weren't thinking positively enough. And we see that still now. People have lost their battle with X, Y, and Z as if somehow it's a failure on their part.
I always say, when people say, how do you think you survived HIV? I say the large part of it is down to luck. The timing was just right. If I'd caught it a year earlier, I would have died. If I had the kind of genes that made you fat, that made you thin rather than fat, I would probably have died. If I hadn't done a lot of gym work during those years, building up muscle, so I lost fat rather than muscle, then I might have died. If I hadn't been in London and got all the drugs, I might have died, etc., etc., etc. I was on my first therapy that looked as if it was going to work. June 98, my dad dies, at the age of 79. He just lived long enough to see me back into employment, which was wonderful, but I stopped talking, and I didn't realize this. I didn't realize I was terribly depressed for a short period. And that's because I think I was just reacting to the overwhelmingness of it all. I didn't know how to cope with surviving. So the first and only time in my life I've gone to the doctor and said I want antidepressants, and they put me on Prozac, and that seemed to help.
And you've written about this in your essay, Lazarus, for which we'll provide a link to. But I think it's a really interesting psychological situation that one thinks that preparing for death might be the hardest thing to prepare for, but in a way to put yourself in that mental space and then to sort of suddenly have that rug pulled from under you and having to unexpectedly have the worries and slings and arrows of longer living suddenly put back in front of you.
When for a while I was practicing as a psychotherapist, I seemed to do particularly well with the most difficult kind of patients, with people who'd been through child abuse and similar traumas, including war trauma, and understood PTSD, and began to understand that though, HIV wasn't an experience of sort of getting shot at by people in the jungle, it was a very similar experience. People were dying left, right, and centre all round you. So much so that you didn't want to go to any funerals anymore. I remember saying, I'm not going to go to any more funerals unless it's a really close friend.
Yeah, because I remember hearing stories from people where they would say the social event of the week was at Golders Green Crematorium.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still difficult to describe. It's like you've survived, but it's only when you survive that you realise how much the fight to survive has taken out of you. So part of me was furious. It's interesting. There's some anger about surviving. You feel that your fight somehow isn't being acknowledged enough by Civvy Street. And you feel anger on behalf of other people, which is what took me into activism. But it also takes a very long time to get over the feeling that you might die at any minute. One interesting and unlooked for psychological effect that HIV did have on me is that the second most effective thing you can do to not transmit HIV, apart from becoming virally undetectable, is to, if you're the one with HIV, is to become the receptive partner, to become bottom rather than top, because you're much more likely to transmit HIV if you're at the top than if you're at the bottom. And without having any intention of this, after not having sex for a period after he died, when I came back, I wanted to get fucked all the time. And I was actually slightly surprised by myself. And looking back on it, I think I'd taken an unconscious decision that I did not want to put it crudely, to inject HIV into somebody else with my dick.
Now then, you live with a retired doctor, your long-term partner, and how has having a medical professional as a partner made you feel about some of the unique challenges that you face now, living into the second half of your life with HIV?
That's a very interesting question. Partially because he's not an HIV doctor. And so one of the things I've been exposed to is stigma in the medical profession. Not so much from him, but from, recounting some of what his colleagues say and things like that. He's an anaesthetist. He used to work at, I won't name it, but one of the hospitals in London with the highest proportion of African patients and patients with HIV. And he himself is completely okay with, HIV patients, especially as he used to work in the obstetric ward and would deal with positive mothers. But, recounts of some of the comments from colleagues and nurses, and not so much comments, but actions, like still kind of wearing 2 pairs of gloves and all that sort of thing. And it's partially because the risk-averse culture of the NHS doesn't encourage enlightened thinking. If you're not exposed to HIV regularly as a professional, then you can still have some very old-fashioned ideas about it, even if you are yourself a medical professional. And also if you're somebody from a different, born in a different culture, a bit older than me, from Sri Lanka. So, in terms of having a partner as a doctor, I think I've educated him as much as he's educated me. Nowadays, looking forward to one of your questions, how does HIV affect me now I'm getting older? The answer is not at all, or very slightly. But other things have started to creep up on me, and he's very helpful with those things.
What keeps you concerned about HIV services today?
Oh, God. It's going for... at the moment, it's very difficult not to get surrounded by doom and gloom with Trump cutting, firstly and scandalously, all the assistance to Africa. In the long term, perhaps it's right that America should not continue paying Africa to deal with it, to treat its HIV-positive population, and that the national governments need to step up. But they haven't got any bloody money. They themselves are run by sort of, viciously anti-gay and anti-sex governments in all sorts of ways. So at the moment, it's rather doom and gloom in the world in terms of HIV treatment. There's also been cuts made to HIV research, which means the hopeful blue sky science on curing HIV and getting a vaccine for it is being drastically slowed down. So it's difficult not to be a bit despondent at the moment. I'm quite glad I'm not going to the next HIV conference in Rwanda, though I'm jealous of people because they're going to Rwanda, which I'd like to go to, but I think it'll be doom and gloom, so I'm rather glad I'm not going. That's in terms of where the broad global picture of HIV. The annoying thing about it is that we now do have the tools that, if they were used and prescribed properly, could, if not cure HIV, if not bring it down to nothing, at least drastically curtail the number of infections.
What would you say to people listening to this who go, you and me and all the lovers that we had before combination therapy, we should have just stopped fucking until combination therapy came along, and this is all, what was it that police commissioner said? We're swirling in a cesspit of our own making.
When the Ukraine war started, and I was emotionally involved in the Ukraine war more than what happened in Palestine, because I had only recently been doing some jobs in Kiev and was inspired by this country that was trying to sort of develop itself from the Soviet years and from the years of corruption in the 90s that came afterwards, and was trying to turn itself into a westernized democracy with decent services. When the war started, HIV cases went up again, and that wasn't because people were not getting the services. Ukraine did an extraordinary effort in trying to get services to and drugs to people, even though their clinics were being bombed and things like that, right? It was because in wartime, people lose their inhibitions. You know, it's like Quentin Crisp recounting World War II. He got more sex in the air raid blackouts than he'd ever done before or since. I was hearing stories about the Ukrainian troops on the front line demanding PrEP pills because they'd started having sex with each other. So I think if HIV was like a war, then on the one hand, it frightened a lot of people off from having sex, but on the other hand, there was a certain kind of end of the world who gives a fuck feeling about it as well. And that was deeply disapproved of by a lot of people. And there are still people who've ghosted me on Facebook because I was saying, forget condoms, PrEP is what we need. Forget social responsibility. Gay men are perfectly socially responsible creatures. I am one myself, but sex and social responsibility don't always go together. And I also think it doesn't matter how foolish people are, condemning them to a lethal disease is not a justifiable punishment.
Now then, Gus, it's been 40 years since you tested positive. How is living with HIV different, do you think, now compared to then?
Well, I don't really have to think about it a lot. I think about it a lot because I'm still kind of an HIV activist, although the energy invested in that is slowly ebbing away, partially because I'm older, and partially because I'm going back to sort of the loves I had before HIV came along. I was trying to... In those days, I was trying to be a pop star, amongst other things, and I'm sort of remixing my old cassette tapes and stuff like that. Weirdly, I think as you said in your intro to me, I'm trying to there's a lovely phrase you used, the power of accidental purpose. And I thought, yeah, I've never been one of these people who've been sort of driven by a career plan. And in some ways, I've drifted from one thing to another, being, as I say, someone with a sort of terrifyingly low boredom threshold. But I am coming to some sort of understanding of the whole picture. And the whole picture is of someone who has been through an incredible historical event and wants to communicate to a later generation some of the lessons of that event, put it that way. And one of those lessons is that you can't moralise your way out of an epidemic.
So, Gus, I'm curious to ask you a question now about the young generation coming through, people in their teens or 20s who, for one reason or another, are testing positive. And from what I'm hearing, there's a distinct lack of support services for these people. The medicine might be there for them, but actually the emotional support isn't there. And I'm just wondering if there's any messages that you have for them.
It might be a slightly sideways answer, but I work for the thing I've got most of my time invested in the moment now is the European AIDS Treatment Group, who are a pan-European HIV treatment activist organisation. A bunch of us just put together a leaflet on doxy-PEP, not PrEP. Everyone knows about PrEP, now it's doxy-PEP. You take that to avoid catching syphilis and the chlamydia and stuff, right? And I wrote it in collaboration with a Czech guy. It was designed by a Turkish guy, and it was put online by a Greek guy, all gay men. So there is a community out there. We know that even in Britain, the cuts are having an impact on peer group services. But having said that, when I first arrived on the gay scene, there was really I think I'm right in saying there was no funded gay service around at all. And I joined Gay Switchboard, and it was one of the best decisions I'd ever made in my life. And if you are in a position to volunteer for something, that can be the best thing, because then it can lead your way to finding your tribe, finding your group of buddies, finding the people who are there to support you.
Absolutely. And I think it's great to find these tribes sometimes away from spaces of sex and alcohol. Not that there's anything wrong with sex and alcohol, but it's good to sometimes find community in other spaces too.
It is, yes.
Now then, Gus, as we come to the end of this program, I like to create a moment of remembrance, a sort of audio version of taking us to that iconic garden where the London Lighthouse was. And I would like to ask you, who would you like us to spend the next couple of minutes remembering?
Well, I suspect you know the answer to that because I've already talked about him. But this is Paul. I've often wished I'd done an AIDS panel for the quilt for him. The problem with the AIDS panel, Paul's AIDS panel, is it would have to be twice as big as everybody else's. It would have to have several swear words on it, and it would have to sort of invade everybody else's space, because that's what he was like. But he taught me the power of defiance and the power of absolutely standing up for yourself. He was in many ways a vulnerable, traumatized, difficult person. He'd had a difficult childhood. He had a big drink problem. I don't know if we'd have stayed together, but I think we'd always have been friends even if we hadn't. But he had enormous self-respect. And I learnt lessons from him that you can only learn from somebody you love. And although he was doomed to die because the timing was just wrong, he fought AIDS like a lion by insisting on being himself, literally almost up to the moment of death. So he's always been a role model for me in that sort of way.
And so to close the episode, Gus, what would your postcard to the world say?
I think I said in my form, well, survival is the best revenge, but surviving revenge is also important. In other words, yes, put all your energy into not giving a fuck about what the world thinks of you, because that's where you will find your positive energy. But also, don't let the anger and the stress get to you. You deserve some peace as well.
Gus Cairns, thank you very much for being a guest here on HIV The Morning After.
It's been a pleasure.
If you were moved or informed by what you heard today, please help spread the word. Subscribe to HIV The Morning After and leave a rating and a review. It makes a huge difference in helping others to find it. Your support helps to amplify these experiences. If you'd like to get in touch, suggest a guest, or share your own thoughts, you can email me at hivthemorningafter@gmail.com. And remember, if you encounter HIV stigma in a bar, call it out. If you encounter it at work, call it out. If you encounter it online, call it out. Because if you don't, you're part of the problem. The theme tune is by Pauline Nidu at unstoppablemonsters.com. And many thanks to Murray Lang for his continued support. And thank you for listening. Join me next time for another important conversation on HIV The Morning After. I've been Dan Hall.